Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of the strangest and most fascinating corners of history, mental health in the Middle Ages. Now, I know what you're thinking. How did people in medieval times handle things like anxiety, depression, or just having an off day? Let's just say therapy wasn't exactly in network with the local guild. So before we go any further, hit that like button if you're into history with a twist, and make sure to subscribe if you enjoy this kind of deep dive. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is. I always love seeing how far around the world we stretch. Now dim the lights, maybe throw on a fan for that soft hum in the background, and let's settle in. Let's start with the basics. In medieval Europe, your mental and emotional state, your moods, your tears, your bursts of energy, or melancholic episodes were believed to be caused by a bubbling, sloshing stew of internal fluids. And no, that's not a metaphor. They thought literal bodily juices controlled everything about you. This idea came from ancient Greece, specifically from thinkers like Hippocrates and Galen, and it stuck around for way longer than it had any right to. It was called the theory of the four humors, and it claimed that your health, your personality, your emotions, everything depended on the balance of four key fluids in your body: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. Each fluid even came with a matching personality type. Too much blood. You were cheerful and energetic, until people got tired of you and tried to fix it with a leech. Excess yellow bile. That meant you were angry and impulsive. Great for the battlefield, not so great at the dinner table. Black bile was linked to melancholy, what we might now call depression, and was thought to be caused by cold, dry conditions and too much sitting around thinking. And phlegm. That was for the calm, slow-moving types, the ones people described as maybe just tired. So what happened if you were feeling sad or anxious? You didn't get therapy. You got a bucket and a guy with a knife. The go-to treatment for emotional distress was bloodletting. Seriously. They'd open a vein and just let it pour out, hoping that, along with your blood, your sadness would flow away too hopefully before you passed out. If that didn't work, they'd prescribe laxatives. Because when your soul is hurting, obviously, your intestines are to blame. Makes total sense, right? Physicians using that word loosely here would diagnose you by asking really insightful questions like, do you feel more moist or dry today? They'd examine your urine, maybe consult the stars, and possibly even smell your breath. And the conclusion, always the same. Your humors were out of balance. You were either too hot, too cold, too wet, too dry, or just too difficult to deal with without divine help. And this wasn't fringe stuff. This was mainstream medicine for hundreds of years. So picture this, a medieval person having a panic attack. Do they get tea and a supportive friend? Nope. They get a guy in robes with a humor chart and a very sharp knife saying, let's drain the sad out. But bodily fluids weren't the only thing to blame. If you felt emotionally off, mentally foggy, spiritually shaken, and you couldn't blame sin demons or your neighbor's suspicious loaf of bread, there was always the moon. Yep, the moon. The word lunatic actually comes from luna, the Latin word for moon. People believed that too much moonlight could scramble your brain like undercooked eggs. This wasn't just old wives' tales either. Doctors, clergy, philosophers, even the town well-yeller believed it. The moon, being a celestial body with vibes, was thought to mess with your brain fluids, especially during a full moon. Your brain wasn't a brain, it was a sad soup. And when the moon pulled the tides, it also pulled at your sanity. So if someone started acting strangely, around a full moon, talking to walls, forgetting their name, yelling at turnips. People didn't think mental health crisis. They thought moon trouble. Some folks were even locked up temporarily until the moon calmed down. That was medieval healthcare's version of just wait it out. The moon also got blamed for epilepsy, insomnia, hallucinations, and anything else they couldn't cure, with soup, leeches, or prayer. If you were up pacing all night crying in a field, they didn't ask about your childhood. They asked about the moon phase, and it didn't stop with people. Farmers swore their animals went weird under a full moon. Dogs howled differently, sheep got skittish, and if your ox kicked over a cart, someone was bound to mutter, "Moon's up to something." Of course, there was no science behind this. But to be fair, there wasn't really science, period. Most medical books referenced astrology as casually as we reference coffee. Treatments often included herbs diet changes and planetary alignment checks. Because, hey, maybe it wasn't a mental breakdown. Maybe Mercury was just in a terrible mood. But if you really started to spiral, if you were hearing voices, having visions, or just talking to your soup a little too lovingly, you didn't go to a physician first. You went to the priest. In the Middle Ages, the mind wasn't just a part of the body. It was a spiritual battlefield. Any behavior outside the norm that was seen through a religious lens. Depressed. You probably committed a sin and forgot. Anxious. That's a red flag for demonic activity. Hearing voices. That's classic demon Airbnb behavior. So priests became the mental health professionals by default. Except their version of therapy was confession fasting, and a stern reminder that you're made of dust and should start acting like it. If you were melancholic, you didn't need support. You needed repentance. Feeling sad was seen as a spiritual failing, not a medical one. Joy could be pride. Sadness, sloth of the soul. The treatment. Psalms guilt and maybe a nap on a very uncomfortable mat. But weirdly, some people found comfort in that system. In a world without neuroscience, the idea that your suffering had cosmic meaning, that your sadness was part of a divine struggle, was kind of reassuring. Even if the cure was mostly chanting and guilt, still, if you had a mental health issue in the Middle Ages, your best hope wasn't compassion. It was a priest with good vibes and a low threshold for yelling demon just in case. Let's say things were starting to escalate. You weren't just feeling down anymore. You were seeing visions, muttering in tongues, maybe spending a little too much time having full conversations with your fireplace. In today's world, you might get referred to a therapist. Back then, you got an exorcism. That's right, exorcisms weren't just for the truly wild cases. They were a common treatment for what we would now recognize as mental health conditions. Forget rest and recovery. If you were talking to yourself or showing signs of psychological distress, the assumption wasn't that you were stressed or traumatized. No, the assumption was that the devil had taken up residence somewhere between your ears. The logic was medieval. If you were acting strange, the answer wasn't that you were overwhelmed or in crisis. It was that Beelzebub had signed a long-term lease on your brain and was redecorating. So naturally, it was time to evict him loudly. There were two types of exorcisms, minor and major. Minor exorcisms were pretty low-key, think intense group prayers, a little holy water, maybe some muttering in Latin. But major exorcisms, that's where things got theatrical. Picture a priest in full ceremonial gear, a terrified patient tied down, and an audience of chanting monks humming ominously while clutching crucifixes. These rituals followed a standard script, reading scripture, drawing crosses in the air, sprinkling salt, yelling, "Depart, foul spirit," directly into your face. If you flinched, that was proof it was working. If you didn't, they just shouted louder. There were accounts of people being forced to drink holy water fast for days, or even having incense and sage burned next to or on their bodies. One poor guy had demons smoked out through his ears using a combination of herbs and what we can only assume was poor ventilation and wishful thinking. And if the exorcism didn't work, well, maybe you weren't possessed after all. Maybe you were just inherently wicked. Sorry about that. But exorcisms weren't always horror movie scenes. In many villages, they were community events. People would gather in the town square to witness what was essentially a medieval supernatural showdown. Think of it as part religious ritual, part neighborhood theater, part group therapy. Except the therapy was yelling, and the group was holding candles and watching you twitch. Most of the people subjected to these rituals weren't evil. They weren't dangerous. They were just overwhelmed, traumatized, or neurodivergent. Maybe they had epilepsy, maybe schizophrenia, maybe just a really bad day and a flair for drama. But in a world that didn't understand brain chemistry, an exorcism was the only way to make sense of things that didn't make sense. Now let's scale it back a bit. What if you weren't talking to invisible friends or screaming at the moon, but you were off? You wept without reason. You forgot your own name sometimes. You sat by the fire and stared at the logs a little too long. You weren't dangerous, just unsettling. In this case, you might be treated with what they called gentle care. Sounds comforting, right? It was anything but. Gentle care meant you'd be told your condition was spiritual in nature, not medical, not emotional, spiritual. Your mind was afflicted because your soul was off track. So the treatment, self-reflection, discipline, fasting, and yes, more repentance. Always repentance. They believed that suffering purified the soul. So, if you were already suffering mentally, congrats, you were halfway healed. All you needed now was to pray harder, sleep on uncomfortable surfaces, and chant psalms until either the devil left or you completely forgot what joy felt like. Monks and nuns might guide you through this process. Some were kind and genuinely compassionate. Others were burnt out, half-starving themselves, and honestly just winging it. They'd have you engage in meditative silence, keep a rigid routine, and reflect on your sins. You might even voluntarily join a monastery or convent as a kind of spiritual mental health retreat. These places weren't spas. They were more like spiritual boot camps. You got to sell a Bible and about 8 hours of chanting per day. Sometimes stew, but no guarantees. Oddly enough, for some people, this did help. The structure, the silence, the community, it created a sense of order, a rhythm, a kind of emotional detox, minus the smoothies. But for others, it was just another layer of isolation on top of everything else. Then there were the relics. Ah yes, Saint Bones, a medieval favorite. If you were feeling anxious, depressed, or generally unwell, someone might suggest touching the remains of a holy person. A chipped bone, a scrap of cloth, maybe even a dried up finger, if you were really lucky. These were believed to radiate divine energy. And hey, in a time when everyone believed your soul was the root of all your problems, divine energy was as good as any prescription. Having trouble sleeping, sleep near a vial of martyr's blood. Feeling inexplicably sad. That's what the toe of Saint Euphemia is for. The idea was that holiness was contagious, like a virus, but good. To be fair, this was one of the gentler approaches. No bloodletting, No yelling priests, no being tied to a bed, just a quiet corner of a chapel, a little chanting, and a sacred object. Compared to being dunked in cold water or screamed at by monks, this was practically a wellness retreat. And the thing is, sometimes it worked. Or at least people believed it did. And that belief, that feeling of hope, was powerful. Because if there's one thing medieval mental health treatment had in common, whether it involved bloodletting, moon-watching fasting, or sniffing saint bones, it was this: nobody really knew what was going on. They just wanted to feel like anything could help. So, let's say, things had escalated past herbs and holy relics. Maybe you weren't just sad or anxious anymore. Maybe you were wandering barefoot through the town, whispering Latin to the trees, or passionately debating theology with the local livestock. At that point, the medieval solution wasn't a therapist or a family intervention. It was a room, a small cold-locked room. Welcome to the medieval monastic cell, a kind of spiritual, solitary confinement, used for those whose mental state made them a little too unsettling to keep around, but not quite exorcism material. These weren't prison cells exactly. They were framed as protective isolation, meant to help the soul heal through silence, discipline, and a lot of really uncomfortable bedding. These cells were often tucked inside monasteries or churches. You wouldn't be chained or tortured, at least not physically, but you would be strongly discouraged from leaving. Sometimes for weeks, sometimes for years, your surroundings, bare stone walls, a straw mat, maybe a tiny window for light and food. No conversation, no company. Just you, your thoughts, and maybe a monk who occasionally read psalms outside your door in the kind of voice that said, "I'm not mad, just disappointed." The idea was that madness was contagious, not biologically, but spiritually, emotionally, atmospherically. If you were around others, your condition might spread. So, isolation was protection for everyone else, not you. And that's if you were lucky enough to be in a monastery. If not, you might end up in one of the earliest forms of public asylums. These didn't really exist in a widespread way until much later in history, but by the 13th century, cities like London and Paris were experimenting with them. The purpose: shelter, not recovery, not even basic comfort. The goal wasn't to heal you, it was to keep you contained. But it's important to remember that medieval society didn't always view the mentally ill as lost causes or cursed creatures. In fact, some believed that those with mental disturbances were closer to God, touched by divine forces, or blessed with visions that others couldn't see. Sounds nice, right? Well, it was a double-edged sword. On one hand, you might be treated with a strange sort of reverence. People would say you had a holy sadness, or that your visions were prophetic. You might even be invited to bless crops or participate in community rituals. On the other hand, if your behavior crossed the line, got too loud, too unpredictable, too inconvenient, that spiritual respect could turn to suspicion fast. People who were once seen as divinely touched became demonically infested the moment their suffering got in the way of someone else's daily bread. And for women, it was an even steeper slope. If you were a woman in medieval Europe, overwhelmed, tearful, irritable, or just emotionally expressive, congratulations. You were probably diagnosed with hysteria. Now, diagnosed is doing a lot of heavy lifting here, because hysteria wasn't so much a medical condition as it was a big red flag that translated to, "This woman is making men uncomfortable." Cry too much, hysteria. Don't cry enough, suspicious. Express opinions, definitely hysteria. Ambitious. You might as well be a witch. The term itself comes from the Greek word hystera, meaning womb. The theory was that a woman's uterus could become unmoored and start wandering around her body. Yep, a rogue, floating womb was blamed for everything, from anxiety to fainting spells. And the treatments, yikes, some priests would recommend you guessed it fasting prayer and confession. Others went more hands-on. Herbs were applied, smokes were inhaled, and in some truly awkward cases, manual stimulation was prescribed to calm the uterus down. Yes, that actually happened. Performed by midwives and later by early male physicians who should have been nowhere near that job. And then there was marriage, the ultimate cure. If you were single and showing signs of emotional distress, the answer was to marry. Why? Because apparently a husband would settle the womb. And if you were already married, the solution was usually get pregnant again. That's right. If you were overwhelmed, exhausted, or mentally struggling, the medieval prescription was more work, more responsibility, and definitely no breaks. And if you didn't get better, if you kept crying or talking about your dreams, or, God forbid, expressed yourself through poetry, then the next stop might be an accusation of witchcraft. Because nothing screams mental health crisis like growing herbs, feeding stray cats, and asking too many questions. Still, not every woman was doomed. Some found shelter in convents where life was calmer. Expectations were lower, and emotional pain could be interpreted as spiritual struggle. Some nuns even wrote about their anguish in shockingly modern ways, minus the demonic metaphors, of course. But for the average medieval woman dealing with anxiety trauma or burnout, the safest strategy was simple. Keep it quiet. Keep it brief. And never ever talk to your cat in public. Now, let's talk about one of the unexpected heroes of medieval mental health care, the herbalist. You know the type. Usually an older woman, a little eccentric, probably lived in a smoky cottage at the edge of the village, surrounded by drying plants and too many cats. She wasn't officially trained, no university degree, no fancy Latin, but she knew things. Things passed down through generations. Things that worked. These wise women, sometimes called cunning folk, were the unofficial therapists of their time. They didn't ask about your humors or check the moon's alignment. They asked when the sadness started, how you were sleeping, whether your mother-in-law was bothering you again, their treatment plan, a warm tea, a fragrant balm, maybe a mugwort poultice or a little poppy tincture to help you sleep. And most importantly, someone to listen. Of course, they couldn't advertise this as talk therapy, so they disguised it as advice about herbs. But make no mistake, these women were doing what physicians and priests often couldn't provide in comfort without judgment. They treated sorrow with lavender anxiety, with chamomile and heartbreak, with balm and honey. In extreme cases, a bit of opium. You might lose an afternoon, but you'd wake up feeling better. And yes, sometimes their remedies were a little odd. Onion poultices on your feet, frog legs in your bathwater. You had to take the weird with the wise. But in a time where other options involved being locked away, exercised, or bled half to death, the herbalist's smoky hut was practically a mental health spa. Unfortunately, the church didn't always approve. Herbalists operated outside the religious system. They didn't quote scripture. They didn't demand penance. They just helped, which made them very dangerous. If they got too popular, too confident, or too vocal, witchcraft accusations weren't far behind. It was a fragile balance, help people, but not too much. Still, they were often the only refuge for people suffering from what we now call depression, trauma, or just sheer exhaustion from being alive in the 1300s. And if you were lucky, your village had one of these women. A little strange, yes, but with hands that healed, and a heart that listened. And that, more than anything, was what most people needed. So far, we've walked through bleeding prayer isolation, floating wombs, and sage-burning ear detoxes. But medieval mental health treatments had one more category. One that makes you wonder if the doctor was just bored, sleep-deprived, or maybe drunk on fermented goat milk. Welcome to the world of truly imaginative remedies. These weren't just eccentric, they were surreal. Think of them as medieval experimental treatments that came from equal parts desperation, folklore, and a total lack of understanding about how brains actually work. Let's start with one of the more bizarre entries, the dead owl method. Yes, this was real. If you were suffering from sadness, confusion, or just had too many thoughts, some healers believed that tying a dead owl to your head could draw the melancholy out through your skull. The owl, being a symbol of wisdom, was thought to absorb the bad thoughts. In reality, it mostly absorbed flies and concern from your neighbors. Still, people tried it. Then we have gemstone therapy, medieval edition. Physicians, again using that word, generously recommended powdered emeralds for anxiety. You'd either rub the glittering dust onto your chest or consume a small amount. It was supposed to calm the nerves and rebalance your soul. Instead, it probably shredded your insides and emptied your wallet. And if gems weren't your thing, maybe astrology was. Mental disturbances were often blamed on the planets being out of alignment. If you were feeling off, it might not be your fault. It might just be that Mars was cranky, or Saturn was casting shade. The treatment: wait it out, or wear certain herbs under the right moon phase. Basically, vibe check your emotions against the sky. One medical manual even suggested wrapping a patient in wolf skin during a thunderstorm. Why? To scare the madness out. Because apparently, nothing says healing like weather-based trauma in a fur onesie. Another treatment involved whispering your troubles into the left ear of a black dog, then letting it run off into the woods with your sadness. Was it symbolic? Was it spiritual? Was it just an excuse to talk to a dog and hope for the best, all of the above? If nothing else, the dog got some affection. And then there were birds. Oh, the poor birds. Some healers would stuff smoked herbs into pigeons, wave them around the patient's head, and then release them, believing the bird would carry the illness away. Imagine sitting in your cottage overwhelmed with existential dread, and someone starts swinging a pigeon full of oregano around your face. Very therapeutic. But if all else failed, there was always pilgrimage. That was the medieval version of log off touch grass and walk 500 miles. If you were suffering emotionally, spiritually, or mentally, someone might suggest a holy journey to a sacred site. And this wasn't a stroll through the village. This was a full-on trek across mountains, rivers, and often plague-ridden lands. The goal: divine clarity, spiritual healing, or just enough foot blisters to distract from your mental turmoil. Many pilgrims never made it. Others came back with new illnesses. But hey, sometimes replacing one problem with another was considered progress. These strange, often absurd treatments reveal something important people were trying. In their own way, they were experimenting, hoping and reaching out for solutions. They didn't have neuroscience or psychology. They had herbs, stars, and pigeons, and in some twisted way, it made sense to them. Now let's zoom out and look at how society as a whole treated people with visible mental illness. Imagine someone walking through a medieval town, mumbling to themselves, laughing at shadows, maybe blessing rocks or cursing puddles. In modern times, we might intervene, offer help, or at least call a mental health professional. But in the Middle Ages, sometimes they just let you be. Really? In an odd twist of compassion, public eccentricity wasn't always punished. If your behavior was loud, but nonviolent, bizarre, but harmless, you might become what the village quietly called the town madman or natural fool. Every community had one, maybe two. They were the people everyone knew odd, unpredictable, but tolerated, sometimes even cared for. A baker might leave food out. A blacksmith might patch up their shoes. Children were told not to stare, which meant they always stared. These individuals often lived on the edges of society, sleeping in barns, porches, or literal barrels. Shout out to Diogenes, the original barrel enthusiast. They weren't treated with dignity in any modern sense, but they weren't always treated with cruelty either. It was more like society collectively shrugged and said, "Yeah, that's just old Tom." In some rare cases, these fools were thought to be divinely touched. Their ramblings were considered prophecies, their gibberish mystical insight. As long as they didn't cause harm, they existed in this strange gray area between curiosity and caution. But that patience had limits. If the behavior became violent, disruptive, or just a little too unsettling, if the town madman started shouting during Mass or stripping naked in the marketplace, that quirky tolerance turned into fear. And fear in medieval times rarely ended well. At that point, the options narrowed: fast isolation, institutionalization, or in some cases, execution. Because while the medieval world occasionally showed kindness, it also had zero systems of support. No clinics, no outreach, no understanding. Just a spectrum that ran from "he's a holy fool" to "tie him up before he curses the crops." And then there was acedia, a condition so specific and spiritual that it deserves its own spotlight. Acedia, pronounced O-C-D, wasn't just another term for sadness. It was considered a sin, a spiritual laziness, a failure to feel joy in God's creation. Imagine clinical depression being labeled not as an illness, but as moral apathy. Monks were particularly vulnerable to acedia. They even had a nickname for it, the noonday demon. Picture this: it's noon. You're supposed to be copying psalms in a cold monastery. Instead, you're staring out the window, wondering what the point of any of this is. That's acedia. It looked like fatigue, restlessness, numbness, what we might now call burnout or depression. But in the 12th century, it was a crisis of the soul. And how did they treat it? With guilt. If you felt nothing, that meant you weren't praying hard enough. If you were tired, you were lazy. If you were miserable, clearly your pride was getting in the way of your spiritual duties. You didn't need rest. You needed more chores and fewer feelings. Even worse, acedia was considered contagious, not in a biological sense, but emotionally. One monk's sadness could infect the whole community like mildew in the soul. So if you were struggling, you weren't just letting yourself down. You were endangering the spiritual health of the entire monastery. The solution: prayer, more fasting, maybe confession. Possibly writing your sins down in alphabetical order, but definitely not rest. Because in a world where everyone owned 2 shirts and one of them had fleas, the idea of taking a break for mental health was laughable. Joy was suspicious. Sadness was sinful. And laughter. Oh, laughter was a whole separate issue. More on that next. Now let's talk about something you wouldn't think would be controversial: laughter. You'd think that in a time when people were dodging plagues, sleeping on straw, and bathing once a month, if they were lucky, a good laugh would be welcomed, right? A little joy to cut through the mud and misery. Not quite. In medieval Europe, laughter was often considered suspicious. Sure, peasants laughed. Jesters were paid to make kings chuckle. And yes, occasionally, a monk might crack a grin if a goose did something unexpectedly risque. But according to many theologians and chroniclers, laughter, especially uncontrolled laughter, was dangerous. It was seen as a gateway emotion, something that could quickly spiral into chaos, sin, or even rebellion. Because if you're laughing too freely, what's stopping you from questioning authority, dancing in the street, eating meat on a fasting day? One of the heavy hitters in this anti-laughter campaign was Thomas Aquinas, a brilliant theologian, no doubt, but not exactly the life of the party. He warned that excessive laughter could lead to spiritual disorder. In his view, joy was fine, but only the internal, humble kind. Belly laughs, too carnal, too chaotic, and if someone laughed at the wrong time, like say during a funeral or while milking a particularly ugly goat, it wasn't eccentricity, it was seen as a sign of madness, or worse, possession. The church even wrote guidelines on when it was and wasn't appropriate to laugh. Novices in religious orders were often explicitly forbidden from laughing during meals prayer or pretty much any activity that could lead to human bonding. Because joy could lead to distraction, and distraction led to sin. Women, of course, had it even worse. A laughing woman, definitely up to something, possibly a witch. A quiet, solemn woman, appropriately pious, or just malnourished. Either way better. Even involuntary laughter, giggles, chuckles, or bursts of joy were considered red flags. If you couldn't control your own body in the presence of Holy Scripture, maybe the devil was tickling your ribs from the inside. Still, humor did survive. People found ways to enjoy themselves, to mock the absurdities of their lives. Village festivals were full of jokes and satire. Peasants whispered dirty rhymes. Wandering minstrels sang songs about farting nobles and clumsy priests, but it was always on the edge of acceptability. Joy was tolerated, but it was never fully trusted. And if you were someone who laughed too much, or at the wrong time, you weren't seen as charming. You were seen as spiritually unstable, maybe even cursed. Which brings us to another form of suspicious behavior, talking to things that don't talk back. In today's world, talking to your cat is quirky. Talking to your houseplants, adorable. But in the Middle Ages, those one-sided conversations were a huge red flag. Depending on the tone, it might get you exorcised, or worse, burned. Let's break it down. Medieval society had very strict ideas about who and what you could communicate with. People fine. Priests ideal. Saints acceptable if you were very holy and very quiet about it, but if you were regularly chatting with animals, invisible angels, or unseen forces, people got nervous. Cats in particular were walking red flags. On the one hand, they were useful, they kept rats away. On the other, they were sleek, independent, mysterious, and rarely seen in church. Not great optics. If you were seen whispering to your cat too often, folks might start assuming she wasn't just a pet, she was a familiar, a demonic companion, sent to guide you through your witchy ambitions. Birds weren't safe either. If you told someone a crow gave you advice about your future, you weren't being poetic. You were violating the natural order. Treason against sanity. Even dogs, humans' most loyal companions, could become suspect if they showed up in your dreams dressed like monks or quoting scripture. That's when people started reaching for holy water. And what about angels? Well, the church believed they were everywhere, watching, guiding, occasionally smiting. Seeing an angel wasn't automatically considered madness, but claiming to talk to them regularly, that was dangerous territory. If you were a mystic nun in a cloistered monastery, your visions might be celebrated. You might even become a local legend. But if you were a peasant named Edgar, shouting at the sky in the town square, you were probably getting tied to a stake, or at least locked in a room for a few months. The difference came down to context. A woman in a convent who had visions while fasting wholly. A woman in the marketplace who saw glowing figures while buying onions, probably possessed. Adults with imaginary friends were also at risk. Children could get away with it, mostly because people thought kids were a little insane anyway. But grown-ups, if you were seen talking to someone who wasn't there, someone who told you what to do, what to say, or where to go, that wasn't mental illness. That was either prophecy or heresy. There wasn't much middle ground. And yet, in the strangest twist of all, some people who displayed what we'd now consider symptoms of mental illness were elevated to almost sacred status. These were the mystics, the visionaries, the ones whose experiences were so intense and persistent that the church didn't dare dismiss them. Think Hildegard of Bingen, who wrote music medical texts and vivid descriptions of divine visions. Or Julian of Norwich, whose revelations during a near-death experience became some of the most beloved spiritual writings of the Middle Ages. Why were they tolerated? Because they were smart cloistered and often very careful about how they described their experiences. Their visions always aligned, at least on paper, with church teachings. And they knew how to frame their revelations as gifts from God, not as personal delusions. But for the average person, especially a poor, uneducated one, having visions wasn't a fast track to sainthood. It was a fast track to disappearance. Which brings us to the bigger picture, the two paths of public versus private suffering. If your mental illness was loud, visible, or entertaining, you might become a village character, a tolerated eccentric, someone people whispered about, but ultimately left alone. But if your suffering was quiet withdrawal, sadness, restlessness, fear, you were often hidden. Families didn't talk about it. Neighbors pretended not to notice. In some cases, you'd be sent away to a monastery, to a distant relative, to a pilgrimage that no one really expected you to return from. It wasn't about healing. It was about removing the burden. There was no mental health care, just shame isolation and the constant pressure to act normal in a world that didn't understand what normal even meant. And yet buried in this bleak system were flickers of compassion. A monk who visited the locked room each morning with warm broth. A midwife who left herbs at a widow's door. A priest who heard confession not to condemn, but to listen. In their own limited, often misguided way, people tried. They believed in demons, yes, but they also believed in grace, in that tension between superstition and humanity, between fear and mercy. That's what defines the medieval approach to mental health. It was harsh. It was confusing. But it was also, at times, deeply human. By the end of the Middle Ages, somewhere around the late 15th century, give or take a plague or two, something began to shift. Not dramatically, not overnight. But if you squinted hard enough, through the candle smoke, and heard over the chants of repentance, you could spot the first signs of change. For centuries, mental health had been viewed through a narrow lens. You were either sinning, possessed off balance in your humors, or being tugged on by the moon like an emotionally unstable tide pool. But slowly, very slowly, a new idea began to creep in. What if not all madness was divine punishment? What if it wasn't always the devil or too much phlegm? What if something inside the body, not just the soul, was malfunctioning? And just like that, philosophy and science started sneaking into the conversation. Thanks to scholars in the Islamic world, especially in cities like Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba, ancient Greek medical texts had been preserved, studied, and expanded upon for centuries. These works, along with new insights from Arabic and Persian physicians, began making their way into medieval Europe via translations in Spain and Sicily. Western scholars were suddenly reintroduced to thinkers like Hippocrates and Galen, but this time with commentary and upgrades. They also encountered brilliant Muslim physicians like Avicenna ibn Sina, who didn't just believe in bodily humors, but also described conditions that sounded suspiciously modern, like mood disorders, hallucinations, and even obsessive thinking. His work, The Canon of Medicine, became one of the most influential medical texts in Europe for over 500 years. It outlined treatments that, while still based on humoral theory, acknowledged that the brain might actually play a role in behavior. Shocking, I know. In other words, medicine was beginning to stretch its legs. People started thinking about the body as a system that could be studied and influenced. Anatomy became trendy among scholars. Dissection was making a very cautious comeback. And while most physicians still couldn't do much more than diagnose you as too damp, the fact that they were even trying to separate the body from the soul was a big deal. Alongside this slow-moving medical evolution, the idea of charitable care started to grow. In the Islamic world, hospitals called bimaristans had already existed for centuries. They weren't just places to die, they were centers of healing, and many included special areas for patients suffering from mental disturbances. These wards offered gardens, soothing music, and even gasp conversation. This model gradually inspired similar efforts in Christian Europe. By the 13th and 14th centuries, a few cities, London, Paris, Valencia, began separating out mentally ill patients from general hospital wards. These weren't great places by today's standards, but compared to being locked in a cellar or exorcised in front of the mayor, they were a step forward. Some of these institutions even attempted gentle care, fresh air, calm environments, and a routine. The idea was no longer just to contain or shame, but maybe just maybe to support. This wasn't driven entirely by compassion, of course. Cities were growing. Crowds didn't tolerate wandering madmen, as well as villages had. Urban administrators wanted order. But even if it started with control, it occasionally stumbled into kindness. And then came the printing press. When Gutenberg rolled out his famous contraption in the mid-15th century, it didn't just kickstart the Renaissance, it changed how knowledge spread. Before this, if you wanted to learn about the human mind, you had to copy texts by hand, or hope your local monastery had a book that wasn't entirely covered in mildew and marginalia. Now, medical texts, philosophical essays, translations of ancient works, they could be reproduced, shared, and debated across borders. New ideas about the mind and body, how they worked, how they failed, began circulating faster than ever before. Not quickly by TikTok standards, but revolutionary for the time. Suddenly, madness wasn't just a moral failing or a celestial punishment. It was something scholars were beginning to view with curiosity instead of just condemnation. And nowhere was this tension between old beliefs and new curiosity more obvious than in how society viewed nobility. Let's zoom in for a moment. Picture a noble family in the late Middle Ages gilded halls, silk robes, 27 forks for 3 types of soup. To the outside world, they had it all: wealth, influence, and God's favor. But behind those ornate doors, you'd often find emotional collapse, spiritual dread, and mental breakdowns whispered about in darkened corners of palaces. Why? Because being noble wasn't just about privilege, it was about performance. Every gesture, every sentence, every eyebrow twitch was watched, judged, and remembered. To show weakness was to risk everything: marriage prospects, social rank, even your estate. And the pressure was intense. In France, nobles were expected to show up at Versailles for the king's waking rituals. Miss a beau, use the wrong fanion at the wrong time. That wasn't just faux pas. It was political suicide. In Japan, the Heian elite lived in a world where emotions had to be coded into poetry. If you were sad, you wrote a haiku. If you were enraged, you adjusted your sleeve with slightly more drama. You weren't allowed to feel, you had to perform feeling. The result, a whole class of people suffering in silk. Behind closed doors, some nobles cracked. Mental illness became a private family shame. Sons were sent away to monasteries. Daughters were declared delicate and quietly removed from court. Letters were burned, names were erased. And the saddest part, many of these people weren't monstrous. They weren't cursed or sinful. They were just exhausted, anxious, overwhelmed by pressure, and terrified of disgrace. Some of them found solace in writing, diaries filled with sorrow, shame, and unspoken fears. Others found it in retreat, leaving court life behind to live in rural estates or quiet religious houses. But for most, there was no escape. Nobility was a trap, wrapped in gold leaf and tied with a ribbon of generational expectation. And in that silence, mental illness flourished not as rebellion, but as slow erosion. Still, even in the suffocating air of noble estates, the seeds of change were growing. The idea that suffering wasn't always spiritual failure, but sometimes psychological strain was creeping in through medicine, through philosophy, and through the painfully honest reflections of people who had everything except peace. In a world where nobles were expected to glide through palaces with grace and silence, some decided not to. Not every aristocrat followed the script. Beneath the layers of etiquette, behind the centuries of family pressure and political obligation, some cracked yes, but others resisted. And rebellion among the nobility. It didn't always look like torches and mobs. Sometimes it looked like skipping a ritual. Sometimes it looked like poetry. At Versailles, rebellion could be as subtle as refusing to attend the king's morning lever, that bizarre ritual where nobles lined up to watch Louis XIV get out of bed. You might think, what's the big deal about skipping a wake-up call? But in court life, this was an act of defiance. Not showing up meant losing favor, and losing favor meant political death. Others rebelled by choosing what they wore, opting for bold colors, outdated styles, or controversial embroidery. In a court where fashion was politics, wearing the wrong shade of blue wasn't a fashion faux pas. It was a social hand grenade. Then there were those who married for love, not alliance. That in many noble circles was considered outright treason against your bloodline. Some were disowned. Others simply vanished from the guest list of every significant party until they no longer mattered. In England, aristocrats expressed rebellion by turning to art and literature. Take Lord Byron. He didn't just write poetry, he lived it, scandalously. He traveled with lovers, cross-dressed, insulted Parliament, and challenged every norm of noble behavior. He was both adored and loathed, a walking middle finger to the establishment wrapped in silk and scandal. Others resisted more quietly. They simply disappeared into the countryside. They stopped going to balls. They stopped pretending to enjoy court life. They retreated, a silent protest against a system that demanded constant performance. In Russia, rebellion was riskier. Supporting revolutionary ideas, even secretly, could get you exiled or worse. Some nobles hosted poetry salons that doubled as political forums. Radical ideas were slipped between lines of verse disguised as metaphors. Others taught their serfs to read an act so subversive it could be considered treason. In Japan, noble defiance was subtler still. A poorly timed poem. A gift that concealed an insult. A refusal to follow mourning rituals. One nobleman didn't shave his head after the death of a family elder. A silent rejection of tradition that spoke louder than any speech. Some noble women resisted by falling in love through poetry. Not just flirting, but constructing entire emotional relationships through verse. In a world where they had no political power, their pens became weapons. And their rebellion, elegantly composed, meticulously phrased, and utterly scandalous. And then there were those who simply chose to fade out. They faked illnesses, they locked themselves in libraries, they pretended to be obsessed with astronomy or botany or theology, anything that kept them away from the suffocating dance of politics. These weren't loud revolutions. There were no swords, no battle cries. But they were revolutions, nonetheless quiet personal acts of defiance that chipped away at the illusion of perfect obedience. Because, here's the truth, not all nobles wanted the power, the titles, or the legacy. Some just wanted to breathe. And speaking of legacy, that was the final crushing obsession of noble life. Legacy wasn't just a hope. It was a duty. Everything they did, every ball they hosted, every alliance they forged, every piece of land they acquired was for legacy. It wasn't about being remembered fondly. It was about being remembered at all. Their names were etched into family crests, marble tombs, and elaborate portraits. Their lives became symbols, tools to extend the family name beyond death. But here's the twist that no one told them. Most of them weren't remembered. We recall the kings, the queens who lost their heads, the generals who changed maps. But the average noble, the one who spent their life managing estates, marrying strategically, and hosting forgettable feasts, gone. Their stories exist only in fragments. Unsigned letters, half-burnt ledgers, crumbling portraits in dusty galleries. The legacy they obsessed over was often erased by time scandal or simple irrelevance. In France, the revolution didn't just guillotine people. It guillotined bloodlines. Names were banned, estates were seized, portraits were vandalized. The aristocrats who had spent centuries obsessing over how history would remember them were scrubbed from the record. Some tried to escape. They hid jewels in chimney bricks, changed their names, fled to foreign courts. A few survived. Most did not. Even in England, where nobles were more protected, many fell into financial ruin. Their vast estates crumbling. Their family names absorbed into newer, wealthier lines. Their portraits hung in libraries no one visited. In Japan, the aristocracy was eventually outpaced by the samurai class and later by political modernization. Their poetry, their rituals, their codes of conduct faded into museum displays. Their relevance evaporated, and yet despite all that, they kept performing. Even when they sensed the end, they continued to host, to bow, to compose, to endure. Because that's what nobility was, an illusion held together by ritual. They didn't dare stop performing, because to stop was to vanish. But perhaps the cruelest part of this obsession with legacy was how fragile it was. Some nobles spent fortunes commissioning epic biographies, sponsoring churches, hiring court painters to capture their most regal expressions. And yet their names live only in footnotes. Others who never cared about legacy, who rebelled, who vanished, who scribbled poems instead of policies, somehow survived in memory. Their defiance was more lasting than any dynasty, because legacy isn't just what you leave behind. It's what people choose to remember. And in a world obsessed with being eternal, most nobles were just elaborate costumes worn for a generation, then tossed aside by history. The palaces crumbled. The titles faded. The scandals were forgotten. But the pressure to perform, that remains. Because in the end, the performance was all they had. The legacy was just the illusion. In the final act of noble life, the quietest and perhaps most human part, lay a secret that was never written in letters, never painted in portraits, and rarely spoken aloud. Emotional repression wasn't just common, it was required. To be a noble wasn't just about land bloodlines or ballrooms. It was about masking your emotions so thoroughly that no one, not even your closest kin, could detect what storm might be raging inside. Joy, sorrow, fear, rage, all were measured, edited, or buried beneath layers of etiquette. At Versailles, where every movement was a calculated gesture of political survival, emotional restraint was king. You didn't flinch. You didn't sweat. You didn't mourn too hard or celebrate too loudly. Every smile was strategic. Every silence was a statement. If you cried, it was behind a curtain. If you laughed too freely, people whispered. The phrase "to lose control" wasn't just social, it was existential. Lose your temper, your tears, your composure, and you might lose your place. This wasn't just etiquette, it was defense. Because in a world where every conversation was a potential rivalry, every shared glance, a gamble, your inner world had to stay exactly that inner. Any crack in your emotional armor became gossip, and gossip in noble society was currency. A single misstep could be weaponized for years. From a young age, noble children were trained not to feel too much, not to react. A noble girl might be told, "Smile even if you're crying." A boy might hear, "Stand still, even if it hurts." Emotions were like wild dogs, best kept leashed, fed only occasionally, and never shown in public. Even grief had a script. There were proper ways to mourn, proper colors, proper lengths of silence, proper kinds of weeping. Too little sadness meant you were cold. Too much suspicious, possibly unhinged. In England, the famous stiff upper lip became a noble virtue. You didn't complain. You toasted with trembling hands. You swallowed shame and fear like bitter wine. Behind closed doors, however, the masks often cracked. Journals, those quiet confidants, tell the real story. Volumes of anguish, regret, suppressed rage, and existential dread penned in the careful script of someone who had no one else to talk to. These diaries were emotional vaults, filled with screams that couldn't be spoken. In some cases, the pressure of perfect presentation became too much. Nobles broke down at court, collapsed during ceremonies. Some were quietly sent to remote estates to rest. Others were institutionalized, their names removed from family trees, their portraits taken down from hallways. They became whispered tragedies, the cousin who lost her senses, the uncle who went strange. And yet the show went on, because the greatest unspoken rule of noble life was this: you do not stop the performance, even at the cost of your health, even at the cost of your sanity. In Japan, during the Heian period, emotions were communicated through symbolism, fans, flowers, sleeve movements, and poetry. A single cherry blossom placed too early could mean despair. A fan half opened meant heartbreak. A noble woman might never say "I miss you," but she'd compose a 31-syllable poem that said everything and nothing at once. It was elegant, it was exquisite, and it was exhausting. Imagine never being able to speak plainly, never being able to scream, never being allowed to fall apart even quietly. This repression wasn't just aesthetic, it was spiritual. Nobles believed, or were taught to believe, that self-control wasn't just good manners, it was divine. To govern your impulses was to reflect God's order. Passion was for peasants. Tears were for commoners. And yet many nobles, especially in their later years, began to crack open. As the weight of performance wore down the body and mind, some turned inward. They began to ask questions no ball could answer. What was the point of it all? Was there peace beyond status? Could there be meaning outside of performance? This is where we start to see the nobility's complex relationship with spirituality. For all their earthly power, many nobles were plagued by spiritual dread. They had everything: wealth, comfort, legacy, and yet their souls were screaming, because deep down, they feared it wasn't enough. In Catholic France, older nobles, after decades of indulgence, often turned toward religious mysticism. They built chapels, funded monasteries, sought out visionaries, not just for appearances, but out of genuine desperation. They wanted to know, was there forgiveness? Was there meaning? Even Louis XIV, the great Sun King, who defined opulence and controlled the most dazzling court in Europe, became deeply religious in his final years. Racked with guilt over the wars he waged and the vanities he indulged, he gave away fortunes to the church, wore simpler clothing, and begged priests to pray for his soul. In Orthodox Russia, things were even more intense. Nobles lived under the double pressure of political duty and spiritual perfection. The czars were seen as chosen by God, but also incredibly paranoid. To serve the czar was to carry enormous weight, both worldly and eternal. Some nobles turned to a peculiar kind of holy figure known as the Fool for Christ, wandering mystics who dressed in rags, screamed prophecies, and rejected all comfort. Strangely, these madmen were sometimes the only people nobles trusted, because they had nothing to gain, and yet they told the truth. In Japan, noble samurai often turned to Zen Buddhism as their careers wound down. They sought stillness, emptiness. They meditated in gardens, wrote haiku about impermanence, and tried to find peace in a world that never allowed them rest. And then there were the nobles who took their own lives, not always out of shame, but out of a desire for spiritual release. A final, deliberate act of control in a life where they'd had so little. Because the tragedy of noble life was this: they were born at the top, but rarely lived for themselves. Every step was choreographed, every word calculated. They spent decades serving a system that demanded perfection, but offered no forgiveness. And when the curtain began to fall, when their beauty faded, their influence waned, or their minds began to fray, they found themselves utterly alone. Behind the diamonds and portraits and ceremonial swords was a person who had never been allowed to feel freely, never allowed to fall apart, never allowed to stop performing. And that's where many of them broke, in silence, in solitude, in shame, because noble life, despite its silk and gold, was for many a velvet prison, beautiful on the outside, crushing on the inside. So what happens when you remove the velvet curtain? When you strip away the titles, the embroidery, the Baroque language, and the silver goblets, what's left of noble life? Painfully often, it was just a human being scared and tired. But the saddest irony is that the very system that created nobility also made it impossible for nobles to seek help. Because help meant admitting weakness. Admitting weakness meant risking exile shame, and the one thing they feared more than death, irrelevance. And yet there were exceptions. In the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, we start to see a handful of nobles, scholars, and mystics pushing back. Quietly at first, then with ink, then with entire philosophical movements. Take Erasmus of Rotterdam, a thinker born in the 15th century, whose writings bridged the medieval and modern. He wasn't technically noble, but his words reached every noble court worth its salt. He wrote against hypocrisy, against empty rituals, and most importantly, against the performance of piety. He believed that true virtue came not from titles or gowns or rehearsed grief, but from inner clarity, the kind that no court etiquette could script. Then came Montaigne, the French essayist who dared to write about himself, not in the pompous, self-congratulatory way most nobles did, but honestly, anxiously, introspectively. He wrote about sadness, about sickness, about fear, about death. And in doing so, he cracked the illusion that nobles didn't suffer. Montaigne was a nobleman with land and lineage. Yes, but he was also a man who couldn't sleep at night, who questioned the point of ceremony, who worried about how much of himself was real and how much was costume. His essays whispered something radical to anyone with ears to hear. You are allowed to feel. And that whisper turned into a current, slowly, carefully. In the 16th and 17th centuries, this current swelled. Physicians began studying melancholia, not just as a sin, but as a condition, a treatable, observable state of mind. Still flawed by modern standards, yes, but better than demons and dead owls. Artists started painting faces with emotions, not just stoic gazes or serene holiness, but people in grief, in ecstasy, in torment. Literature exploded with characters who were troubled, torn, and sometimes mad. Shakespeare, in particular, turned madness into art. Think Hamlet pacing in indecision, Ophelia drowning in grief, King Lear screaming into the storm. These weren't just performances, they were mirrors. And the nobility they watched. Some saw themselves. Some looked away. But the idea that emotions were not weakness, that the soul could be complex, wounded, even dark, began to take root. We see this especially in the phenomenon of the melancholic noble, a trope that appeared across Europe. No longer the shining knight or perfect lady, this new noble was brooding, reflective, tortured by the weight of existence. It became fashionable in some circles to be a little sad, to be haunted by poetry, to look out a window and sigh dramatically. You weren't broken. You were deep. Of course, this romanticization had limits. If your melancholy turned into actual madness, uncontrolled, visible, disruptive, you were still in danger. But if you could keep it poetic, if you could bleed quietly onto paper, or whisper your grief into a sonnet, society would allow it. This shift paved the way for what we now think of as mental health awareness, not in the modern sense, but as a crack in the armor. A place where human vulnerability could finally seep through. Even architecture began to reflect this. Castles gave way to manor houses, with libraries, gardens, and studies, places for quiet reflection. Nobles weren't just warriors or hosts. They became thinkers. Some even became patrons of asylums, not to punish the mad, but to house them more humanely. Were these places perfect? Not at all. But they were steps forward, and so we begin to see something that had never truly existed before, spaces where a noble could hurt and not be condemned for it. Still rare, still risky, but no longer impossible. By the 18th century, Enlightenment thinkers took this further. They began to question everything monarchy religion, and yes, even the concept of madness. They proposed that mental illness was not sin, not weakness, but a human condition, tied to biology, environment, and trauma. Nobles, especially those in intellectual circles, started attending salons where mental health was discussed, not just whispered about. They read essays on melancholia, mania, and despair that were grounded in reason, not superstition. And then came the dawn of modern psychology. The 19th century would bring Freud, Jung, and others. But the seeds were planted centuries earlier in the sighs of noble women, the scribbles of half-mad diarists. The silence of grieving counts the sonnets written under candlelight by men who couldn't say aloud what they felt inside. By the time modern mental health care emerged, the noble class, as it once existed, was already vanishing. The guillotine ended many French legacies. Industrialization rendered bloodlines obsolete. Empires collapsed under their own weight. But their stories of repression, of performance, of quiet rebellion live on, not as fairy tales, not as cautionary tales, but as reminders. Reminders that power doesn't protect against pain, that titles can't silence inner voices, that even in the most gilded prisons, the mind finds ways to cry out. So the next time you walk through a gallery and see a noble's portrait, frozen flawless, distant look again. Look past the robes and the pearls. Look into their eyes and ask yourself, what were they feeling but never allowed to say? Because maybe, just maybe, that's the truest story of all. And now we return to where we started, not to royalty or rebellion, not to exorcisms or melancholic poets, but to you. Because the story of no suffering, of medieval misunderstanding, of velvet repression, it isn't just a history lesson. It's a mirror. Today, we like to think we're far removed from all of that. We have therapy apps, neuroscience TED Talks, and mindfulness journals with daily prompts. We wear sneakers, not silk slippers. We sip oat milk lattes, not wine blessed by monks. But despite all that progress, the ghost of the old world still whispers. It whispers in the boardroom executive who doesn't cry at funerals, in the teenager who laughs in front of friends but stares blankly at the ceiling at 2 a.m., in the woman who smiles in every photo because sadness feels like a betrayal of her image. It whispers in our obsession with performance on social media, in our families at work. And nowhere is this whisper louder than in how we treat mental health. We say we've changed, and we have. But still, there's shame. There's that tiny, quiet shame that says, I should be stronger. I should be over this. No one can know. There's the pressure to look composed, to curate, to package our suffering into something aesthetic. I'm not falling apart, we tell ourselves. I'm just tired. I'm just a little off. I'm just going through a phase. We post about healing, but we do it in soft pastels with poetic fonts. We talk about anxiety, but only after we've conquered it. We celebrate the survivor, not the one still struggling. In short, we're still terrified to be seen as weak, just like the nobles. We might not be wearing brocade or worrying about our family crests, but we've inherited their rules in new forms. Don't cry at work. Don't talk about depression on a first date. Don't admit that you're lost when everyone else seems fine. We live in a world that tells us be real, but only if that realness comes with a redemption arc. But here's the truth we rarely say aloud. You are allowed to struggle. You are allowed to not know, to not be okay, to not be polished or productive or photogenic while healing. You are allowed to feel things that don't fit into captions. You are allowed to fall apart, not for drama, not for likes, but because you're human. And in that, you are not alone. When we look back at history, we often focus on the grand battles, kings, revolutions, palaces. But the real story, the quiet, enduring story, is about people trying to survive themselves. The peasant who thought the moon was eating her thoughts. The noblewoman who watched her own reflection and wondered if she was disappearing. The monk who couldn't stop crying but didn't know why. The count who spent hours in the library just to avoid speaking to anyone. These are not freaks of the past. These are our ancestors in pain. People without language for what they felt. People without permission to ask for help. But we have the words now. We have the science, yes, the vocabulary, the tools, but we also have the opportunity to do something they never could. To stop performing, to say I'm not fine and mean it, to listen without trying to fix, to offer comfort without demanding progress, to let each other be messy, slow, grieving, confused, and still worthy of love and belonging. Because what the nobles never knew, what the monks and mystics and melancholics tried to hint at in secret, is this: the path to peace is not paved with perfection. It's paved with honesty. It's okay to cry. It's okay to break. It's okay to rest. It's okay to stop pretending that having it all together means you're doing life right. In fact, maybe the ones who crack, who weep, who wander off course, maybe they're the most honest of all. So here's what I leave you with. If you feel broken, you're not alone. If you feel lost, you're in good company. If you've spent your life performing, but secretly long To just be, you are seen. And if you've ever looked at a gilded painting of a flawless, noble face and thought, they must have had it so easy, remember this. They didn't. They were just better at hiding it. You don't have to be. The age of silence is over. You're allowed to feel everything and still be worthy. You're allowed to step off the stage. You're allowed to live